When was the last time you thought about the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq? Now, if you're like most Americans, it's probably been a while. U.S. troops officially pulled out of Iraq at the end of 2011, but there are still nearly 20,000 Americans there in roles that are not combat specific, and more than 4,000 contractors there on the ground as well. Meanwhile, more than 30,000 U.S. troops remain in Afghanistan, with a full pullout scheduled for later this year. But last month, it marked something of a turning point in our foreign wars. For the first time since February of 2003, that's more than 11 years, not a single American soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine was killed in combat. Now compare that to November of 2004, when we lost 144 Americans in a single month. All told, we have lost around 6,800 servicemen and women in these wars. But the losses, as we all know, go much further than that. Each of those left behind loved ones, spouses, children, parents, and so many, many more. Among them, Artis Henderson. She, a journalist and essayist whose work has appeared in the New York Times, Reader's Digest, and the online literary journal Common Ties. I spoke with Artis recently about her new book, Un-Remarried Widow, in which she candidly shares her story as a young Army widow. The book, it describes her life following the death of her husband Miles, who was killed in a helicopter crash in Iraq in November of 2006. Artis, thank you very much for a few minutes today.
Thank you for having me.
If you could, tell the viewers what happened on that fateful day in November of 2006.
So my husband was out on a night flight in northeastern Iraq. They were coming home from a night mission, and they ran into a sandstorm and lost visibility. And so their helicopter crashed and both pilots were killed.
Explain the process of just even the basics of how you learn that you've lost your husband. How do they tell you, and in what manner?
So today, when a soldier is killed in combat, they send 2 uniformed soldiers to notify you. So I was notified soon after he was killed. I came home from work, and I had been living with my mother in Florida while Miles was deployed. So I came home from work, and I came upstairs, and the door was already unlocked, which is pretty unusual. My mom and I always keep the door locked. And so I opened the door, and my mother was there, and there were 2 soldiers in the living room. And we don't live anywhere near a military base, and so when I saw them and saw that they were in dress uniform, I knew immediately why they were there.
And what did they tell you at that point? Because I'd imagine there's obviously the questions about the how, and then also about, in terms of starting the grieving process, the want to connect with a loved one that I understand you were denied in many ways.
I immediately wanted to know if they had any details, what had happened, if his helicopter had gone down, if someone else was killed. But at that point, it was still so early, they knew almost nothing.
Eventually, you were told that there was pilot error and that your husband was, quote unquote, unrecognizable. This both deprived the Purple Heart for your late husband, and also, I would imagine it denied you the chance for a final goodbye as well.
Yes, absolutely. A death in the military is complicated in many ways. It's difficult that they did not receive the Purple Heart because it was considered pilot error and the crash was considered their fault. So in a way, it's upsetting to think that he died in Iraq during wartime and won't be recognized for that. And in terms of him being unviewable, that is maybe one of the hardest parts of this, because I never got to see him after he came home. I never even saw his coffin.
We've heard the military is a big family. Was it helpful for you that other military widows, did they help in the grieving process? I mean, no one death is the same. How does that work in terms of the military and taking care of their own after they lose somebody, obviously overseas?
I have to say that has been one of the greatest gifts to come out of this tragedy is my experience with the military. The Army has taken very good care of me, and the other military widows I've met have become some of my closest friends. I think that grief in general is a very lonely process, and it has been such a relief to know that other women were feeling, if maybe not exactly the same as I feel, at least with the same depth of loss.
I can just imagine for any other man out there who would be a part of your life to be able to measure up to your late husband would be, to many, I think, impossible. And also, obviously, with that unfinished story, it must be really hard to move on. Have you figured out yet? I know that there's no such thing as closure, but have you figured out yet what you're ready for or what you want for your future yet?
In many ways, I have. I think professionally I've made that happen. I always wanted to be a writer, and now I'm a writer. I live in New York. I've traveled overseas. So all of that, yes. But maybe personally, and at least romantically, like you said, that's still very much a challenge.
Well, and I'm not the only person who's thought so since reading it. Is one of the most revealing and honest books here on this very complicated subject. And again, it's called Un-Remarried Widow. Artis Henderson, I really appreciate the time here today, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
RFL will wrap things up right after this.